By the time I got into like the 11th grade, I learned what it was to go out and hang out. I'm running around with Larry Levan at this particular point, and discovering all these clubs and all this nightlife and stuff. So he took me to the loft for the very first time. There you have it.
So 11th grade, hanging out with Larry Levan. I mean, how old is someone when they're in
16, 17.
So you were hanging out with Larry Levan at the loft when you were 16 years old?
Well, I met Larry actually when I was 14. 14 years old, so I might have been still in junior high school or something like that. And by the time I got into high school, then I began to run the streets with him.
And he was DJing then?
No, neither one of us were DJing.
Larry was really wild when we were young. I mean, orange hair, this, that, and the other, in a period where it just wasn't done, And he went to Erasmus High School, so they weren't having it. They were not having it. In Brooklyn, Erasmus was not having it. Well, I mean, he took about as much of it as he was going to take, and that was it. But I mean, I remember going to have to meet him a couple times at school, and one day I went there to meet him, and Larry would do shows, let me tell you. Larry was outside the school. This one particular day I was going to meet him. He was outside in front of the school on top of this Volkswagen with this orange hair. And he had on a midriff shirt, and he had on these jeans where the hips was cut out. So actually there was only a piece covering up his genitals in the front. Yeah, and the crack is behind, but the rest of his hips was cut out. And he was on top of this car doing this dance of the seven veils, as we used to call it, because he was doing this number and stuff like that. And baby, these boys were standing out there in front of that school, and they were, all of a sudden, they was like, get him. And all I saw was a streak of orange just go. And I'm across the street, and I'm like, oh, shit. So they didn't know me. I just saw them going after him. So I'm running to try and find out exactly where he's going. I mean, Larry could move. And I'm running behind to try and find out exactly what's going on and what's going to happen. I eventually met up with him at his house later on. He got away from him. How, I never know, because there was enough of him. But Larry used to do strange shit like that. And I knew, hanging out with him, I'm gonna either have to know how to really take care of myself, or we're gonna end up getting killed out here.
What happened was, hanging out at the loft, it was the first time I had hung out there. David Mancuso was planning on taking a vacation at the end of that summer, and the loft would have been closing. So there was another friend of mine that was working for Nicky Siano at the gallery, which was the loft's, I guess, direct competition, if you will, even though there was really no such thing. And he was getting ready to go, this friend of mine was getting ready to go into the Air Force, but he had spoke to Nicky and said, listen, I have a friend of mine that can take my place here, if you don't mind. And so Nicky said, yeah, well, I need someone here. And so then he introduced me to Nicky outside of David's loft that night. And I reported to work the following weekend. And the job basically was for me to set up the fruit bar and decorate, blowing up balloons, this, that, and the other, some of everything. And then I brought Larry there afterwards. That's how Larry came to work there as well. Right. And then Larry spent more time hanging out in the booth with Nicky. And I just kind of sort of hung in the periphery and stuff.
And was that when you started to DJ at the bathhouse? And
well, it's interesting. While I was working at the gallery, at Nicky's gallery, T. Scott, who was playing at a club called Better Days at the time, and T. Scott was one of the big DJs in New York at the time as well, had asked me to come and play on Monday and Tuesday nights, because he was playing 5 days a week, and now the club was going to expand and go 7 days a week. But he didn't want to do the extra day, so he asked me if I would come and do it. Now, mind you, I had never played records at that particular point. Granted, I hung around the booth. I hung out with Nicky. We were close. But Larry worked more hands-on than I did, and T asked me if I would come and do it, and I was like, listen, I don't have any records. I can't do it. I don't think I have the ability to do it. And he was like, you know all the music. You can use my records. I'll let you use my, that kind of thing. And I was like, well, if you think so. But I could use the money as well, you know what I mean? Because I'm in high school. I mean, I'm young. There are things I want to do. I want to look cute. I want to be fabulous like everybody else, So I took the job. I did it for about 6 months, and then they shut the night back down because they said there was no one coming.
You're from the South Bronx originally. The Boogie Down.
The Boogie Down. Can you describe what the South Bronx was like when you were coming up in New York?
Do I really have to? Well, when I was coming up in the South Bronx, rap hadn't happened yet. I mean, you know, the most special thing for me was Luther Vandross right across the street. We used to ride the subway down to Manhattan going to school. I went to the High School of Art and Design. He went to Music and Art. So usually by the time we reached 59th Street, you know, he'd go right and I'd go left. But then we would always meet up in the same place going back home. So, but that was the most special thing for me coming out of the South Bronx.
So when was your first DJ gig? Where, what club? What was the sort of the more steady thing that you had going?
It was primitive. And I think they probably wouldn't appreciate me calling it primitive. But I mean, it was what it was for back then. It was back in 71.
This is where?
In New York City at a club called Better Days. And I wasn't a DJ, but a friend of mine offered me the job because he said that he thought I can do it. The club was already open 5 days a week, but they were expanding to 7. He asked me to do it 2 days because he didn't want to do it. I'd had no records. I didn't think I could do it. He felt that I could. I took the job. 6 months later, I was out of the job, but you know, but it was enough to give me a taste of what it was, but I still didn't think about it seriously. And then Larry Levan, who I grew up with at the time, asked me to come and work with him to do lights for him at the club where he was working at Continental Bass. And doing lights for Larry and watching what he was doing up close, you know, Larry would take these extended bathroom breaks where I'm forced to have to play records while he's at the bathroom. So that's, you know, you're not thinking about it, how it's coming together, or the fact that this is what you want to do, but then all of a sudden you kind of sort of fall into it happily by accident. You know, and then you wake up one day and it's 5 years later and you have to seriously make a decision. Now back then, the life expectancy of a club DJ, and this is probably going to all sound weird to you guys, was 5 years. You had 5 years to make it and then move on. You know, you're not going to do this all your life because it wasn't a career as it is now. It wasn't a profession as it is now. But you had 5 years to do it, have fun with it, and then move on. And I used to always tell Larry, listen, I'm not going to wake up one day and be 32 years old and still playing records. Now, mind you, I was like about 16, 17. I'm not going to wake up one day and be 32 years old and still doing this. Well, the joke is on me. Which is why they always say, you know, man makes plans and God sits back and laughs. Because I'm 56 years old today, you know, and I'm still doing it.
So, you moved to Chicago. Why the move to Chicago?
Well, after I left Better Days, I worked at Continental Bass for like about 5 years with Larry. And I went there as Larry's light man because Larry got the residency. And so he invited me to come and do lights for him. And back in the day, that's how you got a job. If you're going to work as a DJ, if you can get a job as a light man, then you can ultimately become a DJ one day because you're right there with the music all the time anyway. And sooner or later, the DJ's going to have to go to the bathroom and he might not make it back in time. So you might have to change that record and you better know how to do it. So that's pretty much how it happened. But while we were there, a couple of years after we were there, we were working with Richard Long as apprentices. So he was teaching us everything about sound. And he didn't do the sound system, he didn't install the sound system for Continental Bass, but he taught us everything about it. Because his theory was, listen, if you guys are going to play music, then you need to know how to drive your equipment. And you need to know everything about it. It's like being a mechanic. You need to know what you're dealing with. So that we wouldn't kill people on the dance floor, that kind of thing, or sever their heads because the highs are too much of this, that, and the other. At the same time, Richard was ultimately turning his showroom into a nightclub. And he asked Larry to do the residency there. So Larry left, and I ended up with the residency at Continental Bass. But to backtrack a little bit, just to answer your question, Robert Williams actually wanted Larry for the warehouse in Chicago. I was second choice, but I didn't mind.
Okay.
I had nothing else. I had nothing else to do. I mean, at that particular point, Continental Bass had went bankrupt. It closed down. I mean, I was playing different places, but I wasn't happy anywhere that I was at.
And at what point did the soundtrack of the warehouse evolve from disco, South Soul, Philly International into house? And what was really the catalyst for that?
If to look back on it now, it probably became more visible by the time I opened up the power plant, by the time I left the warehouse and opened up the power plant on my own. It was pretty well defined then. I had already met Jamie, I'd already done my first remix, and around me people like Steve Silverly and Marshall Jefferson, these guys were working on tracks of their own. And a lot of them had put out a lot of tracks long before I put out anything.
Right.
Yeah. But that's what they were just a lot of tracks that...
So was it just a moment in time when a lot of producers all of a sudden were influenced by the same thing, technology kind of happened, and all of a sudden this style of music was being made simultaneously? I mean, were these people connected? Did they speak to each other, or were they all making the music independently?
I don't know how well any of them knew each other. I mean, apparently they would all hang out at the warehouse and I didn't know. I mean, the warehouse was only open one day a week. It was on Saturday night, and all my focus went into that Saturday night. And I mean, I'm playing from midnight to noon the next day. And occasionally I would do, a marathon where it's like 24 hours. You know what I mean? I did that maybe 3 or 4 times. But all those guys were hanging out. I didn't know. I didn't know who they were at the time. And apparently they were watching me pretty close. But a lot of the music that they were trying to put together was based on a lot of the stuff that I was playing. By the time I had done the remix of Let No Man Put Us Under for First Choice, things had turned around at that point. I'm also working in a record store. Then I meet Jamie. Started working with Jamie. Jamie came into the record store one day with this cassette and asked me if I would consider producing him. And I had never produced anything other than that one remix before that. But I told him, I was like, if you trust me enough to do it, then hey, I'll take the leap of faith, why not?
There's a story that I read actually in a book by Cheryl Garrett.
Cheryl Garrett,
You remember her? She was
a really close friend of mine, and I don't know where she's at in this world. In the book it really quotes
that when everybody entered the warehouse, they were given an acid tab. And during the course of the night, now this may be true, I'm just asking you if this happened, because it's a great story. Everyone was given an acid tab. Whether they chose to take it or not is another thing. But at one point, you would just completely stop the music, cut all the lights, so the room was pitch black, and there would be the noise of a train going through the sound system, and everybody freaked out.
That's half true.
That's half true.
That's half true. One, no one was given a tab of acid when they came through the front door. Now, they sorted that out on their own. But I did a lot of environmental things in that room. I could be very experimental with it. So there would be points in the evening where, the energy level is so high, that I felt maybe I need to give these people a chance to catch up to themselves. So the song that's playing will fade out, or it would fade right into a rainstorm or something like that. And then we turn on the exhaust fans, and the heat in the room would just completely disappear. It would just cool off, and people felt like they were actually in the dark, in a rainstorm. So you can hear it, and then all of a sudden you hear the thunder and this, that, and the other, and it would get really, really intense. And then as the rain began to subside and stuff like that, you can hear a train in the distance. And then all of a sudden, it would just like come right through that room, and people go running, but they would run into walls, they would run into themselves. They couldn't see what they were doing, they couldn't see where they were going. But, in the cold light of the morning, the next day when it's all over and done with, people are standing around outside just talking about that train, that rain. And sometimes I'd have to wait for people to really leave because I couldn't get out of the club because they would just rush me. Some of them loving it, some of them lost their minds on it, especially if they're tripping like that. You think you're really seeing these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it was half true.
Okay.
Or partially anyway.
Actually, that embellishes it just perfect for me. So. And so you moved to New York at that point. You moved back to New York?
Shortly thereafter.
And
things happen for whatever reasons that they do, but you wake up, it's 5 years later, I got to make a decision about what I'm doing. And before I know it, I'm in Chicago. We opened up the warehouse. I got a piece of the business. I'm like 20 years old, and I'm just having a good time. And that's the only thing I was concerned about, was having a good time and showing everybody a good time. And a few years later, then I reached that point where I had to think about the next logical step in this. You're having a great time playing records and showing everybody a good time, but what's the next logical step? How long can you continue to do this? And that's when I began to think about production.
Just to backtrack for a quick second, before you had moved out to Chicago, well, who was responsible in part for bringing you out there, and how did you meet that person?
That is so busted. You just really want to get all of my childhood.
No, everyone. I think it's pretty compelling.
I don't, but okay. Larry Levan and I, when we were kids, we were real juvenile delinquents in every sense of the word. We meant nobody any harm, I promise you. But we were just, we were roughhouses. And we were about 15, 16. We were at this nightclub where everybody was hanging out, and we managed to get inside. When the party was over, we were leaving there. Everybody was usually hanging out outside out front like you usually do, and then everybody began to disperse. So we were left alone, and we were leaving. We were walking up the street from the club, and there was a pastry truck sitting outside this restaurant, on the corner. Larry had the bright idea of the both of us running up inside this truck and grabbing some donuts, because we were hungry. So they had them all wrapped up and stacked up and tied up in cord and stuff like that, because he was obviously making his morning deliveries. This is like about 5:30 in the morning. So we run up inside the truck and we grab a couple of stacks, and now we're running up 2nd Avenue, and we run smack into a police car. Now, there's a friend of ours that used to hang out, just to backtrack a little bit, there's a friend of ours that was at the club that night that used to hang out, used to be at all the parties, especially at the Loft when we were hanging out at the Loft. His name is Robert Williams. So we run smack into this police car. We end up in Central Booking, downtown Manhattan, and because we're juveniles, they send us to juvenile camp. And they would send us to a juvenile camp that's in the South Bronx, about 2 blocks away from my house. So we're sitting in there. I'm nervous. I'm losing my mind. I'm crazy. I'm crying. Larry's sitting back smoking a cigarette and can't be bothered with none of it. And all of a sudden, this guy walks in who's a juvenile counselor to see us. And the person is Robert Williams. Robert Williams was the person that asked me about coming to Chicago to open up the warehouse with him. And he ultimately became my business partner there. Just to kind of tie it all together so you know who's who. But he walked in and saw the both of us sitting there and asked what had happened. I was beside myself. I couldn't speak. Hey, I was a little sissy. What do you want? I couldn't get it out. So when he read the chart and he saw what we were there for, he was like, "You two are so stupid." So immediately from that particular point on, he took us under his wing while we were there, and he watched us very closely and made sure nothing happened to us. It seemed like we were in there for years, but we were only in there for 2 weeks. When you're a kid, everything's like it seems like it's so much longer than it actually is. But we had only been there for 2 weeks. Our parents wouldn't come and get us because they figured, hey, listen, you were bold enough to do something as stupid as that, pay the consequences. And hopefully we would learn something from it. That was the last time I was ever arrested for anything. I promise you. But that's how it started. And Robert and I, what happened was Robert originally wanted Larry for the warehouse, but at the time Larry was building the garage. And I was out of work, so I got lucky.
So, I guess also just to backtrack just a second, because I guess you were at the Loft that night, or the night when with the pastries?
No, it wasn't the Loft. We were at this club called Stage 45. It had no DJ. It had a jukebox. This is how far back it goes. It had to be like 70.
So I guess it was from some of these legendary night spots in New York that so many people read about now who weren't there to experience. What did you bring away from those experiences in terms of your sensibility, your DJing, everything? Can you describe a little for the folks here who can only read about it or see some pictures online?
I don't know how much I can bring to it. It would be so much easier if I could say, you had to be there and then just take you there. You know what I mean? I have people ask me all the time, how much different is nightlife now versus back then, or how different are clubs now versus back then. A party is a party no matter where you go. So there are good parties and there are bad parties, and there are good clubs and there are bad clubs. I think nightlife is pretty much the same. I think technology changes everything. You know, whereas back in the day, you could step up to a bar and get a free poured drink. Now they're usually measured by some machine, depending on where you are. Sound systems were analog. Now they're digital. The sound was much warmer back then. Now it's a little bit colder. What you listened to mostly was song-based. Now what you hear mostly is track-based. You had singers and groups and orchestras and bands and rhythm sections and everything that made up one particular production. You know, now you have one person sitting in a small room doing it. Saying all that, as much as it's changed, it's still pretty much the same, or vice versa. For me, I've amassed an enormous library of not just music, but from playing all these years, and a lot of vinyl, which I'm going to be getting rid of soon. Apart from that, all these years of playing and all the music that I've had to play is all stuck back here. And the sensibility and the approach towards each particular song and the way I've played it over the years and stuff like that pretty much feeds into what I have to deal with now that's current. And I still apply the same thing. I'm not a showman when it comes to playing. I'd rather be tucked away in a corner somewhere and feeding you what I've got. Take it or leave it. Some guys have got to be out front, and they have to have all of this, you know what I mean? And they need to put on a show. I'd rather the music speak for itself, because not everybody has good taste in music, but those who do shine.